The bingo hall was loud that Thursday afternoon. Plastic chairs scraped against the polished floor. The caller's voice echoed through the room, while dozens of elderly women leaned over their cards, waiting for the next number. Someone laughed loudly near the refreshment table. Someone else complained that the caller was moving too quickly. Evelyn Parker sat quietly at the end of a long table. She was 72 years old, neatly dressed in a pale blue cardigan, cream-colored trousers, and comfortable black shoes. Her silver hair was pinned carefully behind her ears. A small brown leather purse rested on her lap. She had carried that purse for almost 30 years. It had belonged to her husband, Robert. The leather was worn at the corners, but Evelyn refused to replace it. Inside were ordinary things. A packet of tissues, reading glasses, a small bottle of painkillers, a notebook, a pen, an old photograph of Robert, and a few things that nobody in the bingo hall knew about. Things that could have changed the way people looked at her. But Evelyn didn't want anyone treating her differently, especially not her daughter. Melissa sat beside her. She was 46, dressed in an expensive beige coat, constantly checking her phone between bingo numbers. "Mom," Melissa whispered, "you're blocking my card." Evelyn immediately moved her purse. "Sorry, sweetheart." Melissa sighed. "It's okay." Evelyn smiled. She always smiled when Melissa spoke sharply. It was a habit she had developed over the years. She had learned that sometimes a mother could avoid an argument simply by swallowing her feelings. The caller shouted, "B14." Melissa quickly marked her card. Evelyn checked hers. Nothing. She smiled anyway. "You're close," she whispered. Melissa didn't answer. She was staring at her phone. Evelyn looked around the room. She recognized most of the women. They had known her for years. Mrs. Collins always brought homemade cookies. Janet complained about her knees. Ruth cheated by using 2 bingo cards and pretending she didn't. The women liked Evelyn because she was quiet. She listened. She remembered birthdays. She brought small gifts. She never talked about money. She never talked about the business she once owned. She never talked about the properties she had accumulated. She never talked about the fortune sitting quietly behind her name. To everyone at the bingo hall, Evelyn was simply an older widow who enjoyed Thursday afternoons. And she preferred it that way. G57. The room became louder. Melissa marked her card. Then she leaned toward the woman sitting across from them. "Do you know what my mother is like?" The woman smiled politely. "What?" Melissa rolled her eyes. "She just sits there." Evelyn kept her eyes on her card. The woman across from them glanced at Evelyn. Melissa continued. "She doesn't do anything anymore." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the marker. "She doesn't even know what's happening half the time." "Melissa," Evelyn said quietly. "What?" "Nothing." Evelyn looked down again. She didn't want a scene. Not here. Not in front of everyone. The woman across from them shifted uncomfortably. Melissa lowered her voice. "She just sits around the house all day." Evelyn's heart sank. She had spent her entire life trying to make things easier for Melissa. When Melissa was a child, Evelyn worked 2 jobs so her daughter could attend a better school. When Melissa wanted piano lessons, Evelyn found the money. When Melissa went to college, Evelyn sold a piece of jewelry her mother had given her. When Melissa married, Evelyn paid for most of the wedding. When Melissa had children, Evelyn became the grandmother who arrived whenever she was needed. She had never complained. She had never told Melissa what those sacrifices cost. And now Melissa was describing her as if she were something taking up space. Something unnecessary. Then Melissa said it. "She's basically furniture." Evelyn stopped breathing for a second. The words landed harder than any insult she had heard before. Furniture. She slowly looked at her daughter. Melissa didn't even notice. She was busy marking another number. The woman across from them gave Melissa an uncomfortable look. "That's a little harsh." Melissa shrugged. "I'm just being honest." Evelyn looked down at her purse. Her hands were trembling. She gently placed the marker on the table. For 72 years, she had been many things. A daughter, a wife, a mother, a businesswoman, a widow, a provider, a protector. But apparently, to her own daughter, she was furniture. Something that sat quietly in the corner. Something that could be ignored. Something that didn't need to be asked what it wanted. The caller shouted another number. N42. Everyone around Evelyn cheered. She heard none of it. She stared at the old brown purse on her lap. Robert had given it to her on their 20th anniversary. He had slipped it across the restaurant table and said, "You always carry everyone else's things. Maybe you should have something of your own." She had laughed. She remembered that night clearly. They had been young. They had been struggling. Their business was tiny. They had barely enough money to pay their employees. But Robert had believed in her. He used to tell everyone, "Evelyn is smarter than I am." She always denied it. Then, years later, when Robert became sick, Evelyn had taken over the company. Everyone expected her to sell it. Instead, she rebuilt it. She negotiated contracts. She expanded into new markets. She bought struggling properties. She learned investments. She made decisions that even experienced businessmen were afraid to make. And eventually, the little company Robert had started became worth millions. Evelyn had never forgotten where she came from. She still lived in the same neighborhood. She still bought practical clothes. She still drove an ordinary car. She still attended bingo. She had deliberately kept her life simple, because she didn't want money to become the reason people loved her. Especially Melissa. That was why Melissa didn't know. Melissa thought her mother lived comfortably on savings and a modest pension. She had no idea that Evelyn had quietly built a financial portfolio worth nearly $18 million. She didn't know Evelyn owned several commercial properties. She didn't know that a large portion of the money from Robert's company had been invested years ago. She didn't know that Evelyn could buy her house 10 times over without noticing the difference in her bank account. And Evelyn had never told her. Because she wanted one thing. To know that her daughter loved her for being her mother. Not for what she could inherit. Evelyn slowly closed her bingo card. Melissa finally noticed. "Mom." "Yes." "Why aren't you playing?" "I don't feel well." Melissa looked annoyed. "We just got here." "I know. You can sit in the car if you need to." Evelyn stared at her. There was no concern in her daughter's voice. Only irritation. Evelyn nodded. "Okay." She stood. Her knees hurt slightly as she pushed herself up. She picked up her purse. The woman across from them watched her. "Are you sure you're okay, Evelyn?" Evelyn smiled. "Yes." She looked at Melissa. "Enjoy your game." Melissa barely looked up. "Okay." Evelyn walked toward the exit. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked if she needed a ride. Nobody followed. When the doors closed behind her, the noise of the bingo hall faded. Evelyn stood outside in the afternoon sunlight. She took a slow breath. Then she sat on a bench near the entrance. For several minutes, she simply stared at the parking lot. She didn't cry. Not yet. She had cried many times in her life. When Robert died. When she had nearly lost the company. When Melissa moved away. When her grandchildren stopped visiting as often. But this felt different. This wasn't grief over losing someone. It was grief over realizing someone she loved had stopped seeing her. Evelyn opened her purse. She pulled out Robert's photograph. He was smiling. She touched his face with her fingertip. "You were always better at understanding people than I was," she whispered. Then she opened the hidden compartment beneath the purse lining. From it, she removed a small envelope. The envelope contained financial documents, property deeds, investment statements, a list of accounts, and one letter from her attorney. Evelyn stared at it. She had been avoiding a decision for months. Now she knew what she had to do. She pulled out her phone. There was one number she had saved years ago. She pressed call. A man's voice answered. "Mrs. Parker?" "Yes, Richard. Is everything all right?" Evelyn looked back at the bingo hall. "No." She paused. "Actually, everything is finally clear." Richard was silent. "What would you like me to do?" Evelyn looked down at Robert's photograph. Then she said quietly, "I want to change my will." There was another silence. "Are you certain?" Evelyn closed the purse. "Yes." She looked toward the doors. Her daughter was still inside, laughing, playing bingo, living her life. Evelyn stood. "I've spent too many years making sure everyone else had something." She took one last look at the building. "Now I think it's time to decide what I want to do with what I have left." And for the first time in her life, Evelyn wasn't thinking about what her daughter needed. She was thinking about what she deserved. The next morning, Evelyn woke before sunrise. She made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the brown leather purse. For decades, she had carried it without ever thinking much about what it represented. Now it felt different. It was no longer just Robert's old purse. It had become a reminder. A reminder that she had spent years carrying everyone else's burdens while quietly carrying her own. At 8 o'clock, Richard arrived. He was Evelyn's attorney and had known her family for more than 20 years. He placed a thick folder on the table. "I prepared everything you asked for." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you." Richard opened the folder. "You're creating the Parker Foundation?" "Yes. And you're transferring the majority of your charitable assets into it." Yes. And your daughter will receive the house, some investments, and the education funds for her children? Evelyn nodded. She'll be taken care of. Richard studied her. But not everything. No. Are you sure this isn't an emotional decision? Evelyn looked him directly in the eyes. I'm hurt. She paused. But I'm not confused. Richard nodded slowly. Then I understand. Evelyn signed the first document. Then the second. Then the third. By the time she finished, her estate looked completely different. She hadn't disinherited Melissa. She hadn't tried to destroy her daughter's future. She had simply removed the expectation that her wealth belonged to her daughter. The majority would go toward helping elderly people who had been abandoned by their families. People who were living alone. People who had spent their entire lives giving to others. People who had suddenly discovered that the people they raised no longer had time for them. Evelyn closed the folder. What do you think? Richard smiled. I think Robert would be proud. Her eyes became wet. I hope so. That afternoon, Melissa called. Mom. Yes. Are you feeling better? I am. Good. There was an awkward pause. Then Melissa said, About yesterday. Evelyn waited. I shouldn't have said that. You shouldn't have. I was frustrated. I know. I didn't mean it. Evelyn looked out the window. Sometimes people say what they really think when they're frustrated. Melissa sighed. I feel terrible. Evelyn didn't respond immediately. Finally, she said, Come over tonight. Melissa arrived at 7. She walked into the house and immediately noticed that something was different. Her mother was sitting at the dining table. The brown purse was beside her. What happened? Sit down. Melissa sat. Evelyn pushed the envelope toward her. What is this? Open it. Melissa hesitated. Then she pulled out the documents. She read the first page. Then the second. Her expression changed. What am I looking at? My financial records. Melissa frowned.